Picture this. You're standing in the courtyard of Nuremberg Castle in 1348, watching as the city's most feared executioner, a man who has beheaded nobles, drawn and quartered traitors, and burned heretics alive without flinching, suddenly throws down his tools and walks away from his assigned task. His face is pale, his hands trembling, and for the first time in his 20-year career of dispensing death, he refuses to carry out a sentence. The crowd falls silent, confused by this unprecedented display of mercy from a man known for his cold efficiency. But this isn't mercy, it's horror. What could possibly be so unspeakably cruel that even professional killers would abandon their duty rather than inflict it upon another human being? The punishment that terrified executioners across medieval Europe was known as the boats or scaphism, and its very existence represents humanity's darkest descent into systematic torture. This wasn't just execution, it was a deliberate prolonging of agony designed to break not only the victim's body, but their very soul, stretching death across weeks of unimaginable suffering while keeping the condemned conscious for every moment of their slow dissolution. Even seasoned torturers, men who had perfected the art of inflicting pain, would sometimes refuse payment rather than oversee this particular form of punishment, claiming that some boundaries should never be crossed, even in the name of justice. The origins of this horrific punishment trace back to ancient Persia, where it was reportedly invented by a king so twisted that his own court physicians begged him to reconsider its use. The method was brutally simple in concept, yet devastatingly complex in its execution. 2 boats or hollowed-out tree trunks were fitted together to form a makeshift coffin with holes cut out for the victim's head, hands, and feet. The condemned person was stripped naked and placed inside this wooden prison, their body completely enclosed except for these protruding extremities. But the true horror was just beginning. Once secured inside their floating tomb, the victim was force-fed a mixture of milk and honey until they could consume no more. This wasn't an act of kindness, it was a calculated assault on their digestive system. The rich, sweet mixture would cause violent diarrhea and vomiting, and since the victim couldn't move or clean themselves, they were forced to lie in their own waste as it accumulated around their trapped body. But this was merely the appetizer to the main course of suffering that awaited them. The boats were then set afloat on a stagnant pond or marsh, places where the water barely moved and the air hung thick with the buzzing of insects. The victim's exposed head, hands, and feet were smeared with more honey, creating an irresistible beacon for every fly, wasp, bee, and crawling insect in the area. Within hours, swarms of creatures would descend upon the helpless prisoner, attracted by the sweet coating and the increasingly putrid smell emanating from within the boats. The insects would lay eggs in every available crevice of exposed flesh, beginning a process that would transform the living person into a breeding ground for countless parasites. As days passed, the horror would escalate beyond anything the human mind should have to endure. The victim's waste would ferment in the enclosed space, creating a toxic environment that burned their skin and filled their nostrils with a stench so overwhelming that many lost consciousness from the assault on their senses alone. Maggots would begin hatching from the eggs laid by flies, starting to consume the victim's flesh while they remained fully alive and aware. The constant feeding of milk and honey continued daily, ensuring that the digestive torment never ceased, and that the victim remained strong enough to stay conscious through their ordeal. The psychological torture was perhaps even more devastating than the physical agony. Victims could see their own hands and feet being slowly devoured by insects, and larvae could feel every bite and burrow, could hear the constant buzzing and crawling sounds that signaled their gradual consumption. They remained lucid enough to understand exactly what was happening to them, to count the days of their suffering, and to beg for mercy that would never come. Many would scream until their voices gave out, then continue screaming silently as their throats became too damaged to produce sound. Records from medieval courts describe cases where this punishment lasted for 17 days before the victim finally succumbed. 17 days of conscious suffering, of feeling their body being eaten alive, of lying in their own filth while insects treated them as nothing more than a rotting meal. Guards assigned to monitor the victims often requested transfers to other duties, claiming that the sounds and smells haunted them in their sleep. Some witnesses reported that the victims' eyes would follow them desperately, pleading for a quick death that their tormentors were forbidden to provide. The most disturbing accounts come from executioners' own diaries and letters, documents that reveal the psychological toll this punishment took on those forced to administer it. Master Hans Vollmer, an executioner from Rothenburg ob der Tauber, wrote in 1389 about his refusal to carry out a scaphism sentence. "I have sent many souls to their final judgment, but I cannot bear to watch a man dissolve while yet he lives. There are boundaries that even we who serve justice must not cross, lest we become monsters ourselves." His refusal cost him his position and forced him to flee the city, but he maintained that preserving his humanity was worth any earthly punishment. The victims chosen for this ultimate punishment were usually those who had committed crimes that struck at the very heart of medieval society's values. Traitors who had betrayed their lords, heretics who had corrupted the faithful, or those guilty of particularly heinous murders might face the boats. But the selection process was often arbitrary and politically motivated. Kings and nobles would sometimes order scaphism, not because of the severity of the crime, but because they wanted to send a message so terrifying that it would prevent others from even considering rebellion or dissent. Perhaps the most documented case occurred in 1356, when a French knight named Sir Bertrand de Montfort was sentenced to the boats for allegedly poisoning his lord's entire family. The detailed records of his execution, preserved in the archives of Château de Vincennes, make for reading so disturbing that historians have debated whether they should be made public. Witnesses described how de Montfort, initially defiant and proud, was reduced to incoherent babbling by the third day as insects began their feast. By the seventh day, his exposed extremities were so consumed by larvae that bone was visible through the writhing mass of maggots. He lingered for another week before finally dying, his last words reportedly being a prayer for his tormentors. Forgiveness. The boats weren't just used as a method of execution, they were also employed as a means of extracting confessions from those who refused to admit their guilt. The threat of scaphism was often enough to break even the most stubborn. The prisoners who would confess to anything rather than face such a fate. Court records show numerous cases where individuals admitted to crimes they couldn't possibly have committed, simply to avoid being subjected to this ultimate punishment. This led to widespread corruption in the justice system, as authorities could essentially guarantee confessions by threatening the boats. What makes this punishment even more horrifying is the deliberate medical knowledge that went into its design. Persian and later European torturers had carefully studied human physiology to determine exactly how to keep victims alive for the maximum amount of time while subjecting them to the most intense suffering possible. They knew precisely how much. Food to provide to maintain consciousness, how to position the boats to ensure optimal insect access, and which times of year would produce the most aggressive swarms of flesh-eating creatures. This wasn't random cruelty. It was scientifically calculated torture, designed by minds that had completely abandoned any concept of human dignity. The abolition of scaphism didn't come about through any sudden moral awakening or legal reform. Instead, it gradually disappeared as executioners themselves began refusing to carry out the sentences. Guild records from various European cities show that professional torturers and executioners formed unofficial pacts to reject scaphism assignments, even when threatened with punishment themselves. They had witnessed too many victims' prolonged suffering, heard too many desperate pleas for mercy, and seen too many strong men reduced to gibbering madness to continue participating in such systematic cruelty. By the late 14th century, most European courts had quietly removed scaphism from their list of approved punishments, not because they considered it inhumane, but because they couldn't find anyone willing to administer it. The few remaining cases were carried out by volunteers from the criminal class who were promised pardons for their own crimes in exchange for overseeing the boats. But even these desperate individuals often abandoned their posts after witnessing the reality of what they had agreed to supervise. The psychological impact on medieval society extended far beyond the immediate victims and executioners. Entire communities would be traumatized by the sounds and smells emanating from the execution sites. Families living near the ponds where the boats were floated would flee their homes, unable to bear the constant reminder of human suffering occurring just outside their windows. Priests reported that attendance at churches near scaphism sites would plummet as parishioners associated these holy places with the screams they heard echoing across the water during services. Perhaps most disturbing of all is the fact that detailed instructions for constructing and administering the boats were carefully preserved in legal documents and executioners' manuals. These guides, written with the same clinical precision as medical textbooks, provided step-by-step instructions for maximizing the victim's suffering while ensuring they remained conscious throughout their ordeal. Some of these documents have survived to the present day, hidden away in private collections and restricted archives where they serve as testament to humanity's capacity for systematic cruelty. The legacy of scaphism extends beyond its historical use as a method of execution. Modern psychological studies of torture survivors have found that the psychological techniques employed in the boats, prolonged helplessness, degradation, the destruction of bodily autonomy, and the deliberate prolonging of suffering, represent some of the most effective methods of breaking human consciousness ever devised. This knowledge has, unfortunately, influenced interrogation techniques used in various conflicts throughout history, proving that the lessons learned from medieval torture continue to haunt humanity centuries later. Even today, forensic anthropologists and historians who study medieval punishment methods report being deeply affected by their research into scaphism. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, author of Instruments of Medieval Justice, described having nightmares for months after examining court records detailing the boats. "It's not just the physical suffering that's so disturbing," she wrote. "It's the calculated nature of it all, the deliberate engineering of prolonged agony. It forces you to confront the absolute worst of what humans are capable of doing to each other." The boats represent more than just a historical curiosity about medieval justice. They serve as a stark reminder of how quickly civilized society can descend into systematic barbarism when power goes unchecked and cruelty becomes institutionalized. The fact that even professional executioners, men whose entire careers were built around inflicting death, refuse to participate in this punishment speaks to the fundamental human recognition that some boundaries should never be crossed. No matter what justification is offered, this story raises profound questions about the nature of justice, the limits of punishment, and the responsibility of individuals to resist participating in systematic cruelty, even when ordered to do so by legal authority. The executioners who walked away from scaphism assignments sacrificed their careers and sometimes their lives to avoid becoming complicit in what they recognized as evil beyond measure. Their moral courage in the face of institutional pressure offers a powerful lesson about the importance of individual conscience in preventing societal descent into barbarism. What do you think about this absolutely horrifying chapter of medieval justice? Can you imagine being in the position of those executioners, having to choose between following orders and preserving your humanity? The fact that professional killers drew the line at this particular punishment really makes you think about what true evil looks like, doesn't it? Let me know in the comments what you think about the moral complexities of this story. I'm genuinely curious about your perspectives on how ordinary people can resist participating in systematic cruelty. If you found this deep dive into one of history's darkest punishments as disturbing and thought-provoking as I did, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more shocking historical revelations that will challenge everything you think you know about human nature. Don't forget to ring the notification bell, because our next investigation into medieval horrors will expose secrets that are even more twisted than what we've uncovered today.